The world has grown louder, faster, always reaching for the next thing. But here, in this quiet corner of time, we slow down. We soften the light, hush the noise, and let the stories rise gently from the past. Not the ones you memorized in school, but the ones whispered behind hearths, stitched into quilts, and tucked between pages now yellow with age. So, settle in, let your shoulders drop, and let's drift back, not to kings or empires, but to the quiet lives once lived beneath the same stars we see tonight, in the soft hush of early evening. Long before light switches, television, and remote controls, the sun would dip below the horizon, and homes would begin to dim, not into darkness, but into something gentler, more tender. The fire was lit, not with the press of a button, but with care, with skill. Flint struck iron, tinder caught flame, smoke curled softly upward into the chimney's mouth, and light began to dance once more upon the stone hearth. This was the moment the day turned inward. The hearth as the heart. For hundreds of years, indeed, across most of recorded history, the hearth was more than a source of warmth. It was the literal heart of the home. The Latin word focus, meaning hearth, eventually came to mean central point. And it was just that. It was where bread was baked, broth was stirred, and daily life gathered. As the light outside faded and the wind began to hush the trees, families would gravitate toward the fire. There, the heat softened stiff fingers. The glow melted away the day's labor. It was a place where time slowed, where thoughts wandered, and where silence wasn't empty, it was full. Fire rituals and rhythms. Tending a fire was a kind of ritual, a knowledge passed down from parent to child, generation to generation. A woman in 17th century England might rise before the dawn to bank the fire, covering it with ashes so it would survive the night, glowing quietly beneath the blanket of soot until it could be revived in the morning. A boy in 19th century Appalachia might be tasked with fetching firewood each dusk, stacking it neatly by the hearth to dry overnight. These were everyday acts, but they were sacred in their own quiet way. There was comfort in the predictability, the way the fire always took time to catch, the way it crackled differently, depending on the wood birch for a sharp snap, pine for a gentle hiss, oak for a deep, mellow burn. The sound was never loud, but it was never silent either. It filled the room without asking for attention. Storytelling by firelight. With the hearth came storytelling. Long before books were common or affordable, and long before screens offered endless content, stories were oral, alive, shifting. They were shaped by memory and mood, whispered across generations. A grandmother might recall the tale of a ghostly rider, in the Woodshire voice, low and rhythmic, her hands curled around a warm mug. A child might speak of a fox she saw at the edge of the field, its coat silver in the moonlight. Fathers shared family histories. Mothers passed down songs and sayings. And sometimes, no one spoke at all. Sometimes, the fire was enough. Just watching the flames move slowly, lazily, like ribbons curling and unfolding, was an entire evening's worth of thought. There was no rush to fill the silence. The silence was part of the story. Cooking in the glow. Even meals took on a different texture at the hearth. Bread rose slowly in Dutch ovens, tucked near the coals. Porridge simmered quietly in cast-iron pots, its steam mixing with the scent of smoke and thyme. There was something deeply meditative about preparing food over fire. The attention it required, the patience, the reward. People didn't eat in front of a glowing screen. They ate together, often in the very room where they cooked, the heat from the fire warming both the hands and the heart. Even after the meal was done, the smells lingered of burnt sugar, roasted vegetables, hot tea, and iron skillets, seasons around the flame. The hearth changed with the seasons. In winter it roared, the flames tall and fierce, stretching upward as the wind howled just beyond the window pane. Blankets were pulled tight, feet pressed close. Shadows danced on the wooden walls like ghosts with stories of their own. In summer, it softened, a smaller flame, more symbolic than necessary, sometimes not lit at all. But even in its absence, the hearth remained the center. Its stone presence, a kind of anchor, in the still, heavy air. Autumn was the most poetic when the fire returned with ceremony. The first lighting in October or November was a moment of quiet celebration, the return of warmth, of ritual, of the slow season. Children and imagination children often found magic in the hearth. They'd lie on their bellies, elbows in the rug, watching the fire like it was alive. And perhaps it was. Flames that curled and swayed, sparks that leapt like fairies, wood that groaned like ancient trees remembering their roots. Sometimes they imagined entire worlds inside the coals, a castle of glowing embers, a dragon made of smoke, a witch's kettle bubbling with unknown spells. The fire didn't just warm their skin, it lit their minds. The architecture of peace. The hearth wasn't just a fixture, it was often the architectural centerpiece. In a medieval longhouse, it sat in the center of the floor, smoke rising freely to the rafters. In Tudor homes, it was grand and open, flanked by carved wooden mantels and tapestries faded from the sun. In colonial cottages, it took up entire wall-sit size, reflecting its significance. In many homes, life quite literally revolved around it. There were chairs positioned just soon for grandfather, worn in the arms from years of leaning. A stool for a child, its legs uneven from too much scooting. A blanket draped permanently on the edge, warm and smelling faintly of cedar and ash. Evening winding down. As the hours passed, the fire dimmed. It no longer roared or danced. It softened. So did voices. So did thoughts. A mother might hum as she rocked a baby to sleep beside the hearth. An elder might sip broth in the quiet, lost in memories. Someone might mend a tear in silence, the needle flashing occasionally in the firelight like a tiny falling star. When it came time for bed, the fire was banked once more, covered gently, not snuffed out, but preserved like a secret waiting to be told again in the morning. Symbolism of the flame. Across cultures and centuries, fire has meant many things. Spirit, safety, family, transition. In ancient Rome, the goddess Vesta's flame was never allowed to go out. In Celtic traditions, hearth fires were sacred, lit ceremonially each season. In Jewish homes, candles marked the Sabbath, each flame a symbol of peace and rest. But even in the humblest home, fire offered its own kind of holiness. It asked you to slow down, to sit, to be warm, to stay a while. Stillness in a screenless world. Today, we flip a switch and light pours from the ceiling. We press a button and the room comes alive with noise. But in those earlier evenings, the glow came slowly. It flickered, it hummed, it breathed. It reminded people that even in the darkness, warmth was always possible. And that sometimes, the simplest things, a log on the fire, a story half remembered, a silence shared were enough. Needles and thread. In a world without screens, before social feeds and blue-lit rooms, there was thread. Simple, unassuming, yet full of quiet power. Thread-bound families held garments together, told stories without words. And in the calm of evening, it became something more. It became a rhythm, a ritual, a meditation, stitched into the fabric of everyday life. The humble act of sewing. For centuries, sewing was not simply a task, it was an essential, almost sacred part of home life. Before factories produced endless garments, each piece of clothing was made by hand. Dresses were sewn from bolt to button, trousers patched, socks darned. And every evening, as the day's labor gave way to quieter hours, hands returned to fabric, needles, and thread. There was no need for urgency. The world was slower then, and stitching was part of its slow heartbeat. A mother might rest in a worn wooden chair, her needle gliding through linen. A grandmother might thread her needle by the light of the fire, eyes squinting, fingers practiced. Children watched, learned, imitated. A simple act, but full of meaning. Stitch by stitch, a gentle process. There is something hypnotic about sewing. The quiet pierce of the needle, the tug of the thread, the gentle fold and gather of fabric. It draws the mind inward, away from noise, away from worry. Each stitch a step deeper into calm. Evenings stretched long in earlier centuries, and sewing filled those hours in ways both practical and soothing. Women repaired the family's clothes, not out of hobby, but out of necessity. A torn sleeve wasn't tossed, it was mended. A frayed hem wasn't ignored, it was lovingly redone. And through this gentle repetition, a kind of peace settled into the room. Tools of the trade. The sewing tools of the past were often cherished heirlooms. An antique thimble passed from mother to daughter. A hand-carved needle case, etched with initials long faded. Scissors with handles darkened by years of use. Pins kept in little tins, once full of sweets or spice. Needles were made of bone before they were made of steel. Threads were pulled from flax, or wool, or cotton, grown just miles away. Everything felt closer tactile, real. Even the act of threading a needle was slow. No automatic tools, no magnifying lights. Just the patient breath of someone who had done it thousands of times, steadying their hands as daylight faded. The social side of sewing. Though often solitary, sewing was also shared. In towns and villages, women gathered for quilting bee social evenings, where stories were told, babies passed around, and hands never stopped working. In cottages and parlours, sisters stitched together, heads bent, laughter soft and scattered. Even in silence, there was a quiet intimacy to sewing side by side. It wasn't always work. Sometimes it was artistry. A white handkerchief embroidered with a name, a sampler stitched with flowers and alphabets, tiny stitches spelling out hope, memory, and love. And, while it was mostly women's work, there were exceptions. Tailors, of course, but also fathers who stitched their children's toys, brothers who mended their uniforms. The thread passed through many hands, sewing through history. Sewing's role stretches across civilizations. In ancient Egypt, fine linen robes were sewn by hand for royalty and priests. In medieval Europe, guilds of embroiderers created altar cloths and royal tapestries. In 18th century France, silk embroidery was a sign of elegance, stitched into bodices and cuffs with painstaking precision. During war times, sewing became survival. Women knitted socks for soldiers, patched uniforms, and transformed old curtains into coats. The rhythm of stitching brought a sense of normalcy when the world felt uncertain. And even in enslavement, women stitched not just clothes, but coded messages, sewing resistance into quilts and meaning into seams. Thread became language. A whisper passed from hand to hand. A quiet evening scene. Let us imagine a cottage, late 1800s, a summer evening. The window is cracked open, letting in the scent of lavender and drying hay. Inside, a woman sits by the hearth not for warmth, but out of habit. Her dress is simple, a little worn. Her hands are busy. In her lap lies a faded shirt. One elbow is frayed. She threads her needle slowly, bites the end of the thread, pulls it through. She sews without hurry. Outside, a child sings. A dog barks in the distance. Somewhere, a pie cools on the windowsill. And inside, in the flickering light, she sews. Each stitch, a heartbeat. Each thread, a tether to home. Creative expression through needlework. Not all stitching was for mending. Many women, especially those of leisure or upper class, turned sewing into creative art. Needlepoint, cross-stitch, embroidery. They sewed scenes from nature. Birds perched in trees. Wildflowers swaying in the breeze. Cottages with curling smoke. Some stitched verses from poetry, or initials framed by hearts. The back of the cloth often looked like chaos, but the front told a quiet story. These pieces were framed, gifted, or kept in drawers like secrets. Soft tokens of time passed in peace. Even today, antique samplers survive. The thread slightly faded, the cloth yellowed, but the hand of the maker, still visible, still alive. Mindfulness in the thread. Sewing brought mindfulness long before the word existed. There is no way to rush it. A hurried stitch shows. A distracted hand knots the thread. Sewing asks for presence, for patience, for breath. In those quiet evenings, with only the ticking of a clock and the crackle of fire, sewing was not just something to do, was a way of being. Grounded, rooted, purposeful. In a sense, the thread stitched not just fabric, but the hours together made them whole. Passing it on, many people learned to sew at their mother's knee, not through books, not through schools, but through watching, mimicking. A small child's hand on her mother's, guiding the needle through cloth, the first crooked stitch, the first thimble too big for her finger. These were lessons wrapped in love, in time shared. In some households, every member had a role cutting, folding, pressing, stitching. A single quilt might carry the work of 5 or 6 people, stitched over many evenings, full of laughter and small talk and the weight of daily life. The finished quilt wasn't just warm, it was memory made tangible. Stillness and simplicity. Today, few of us sew out of necessity, and yet, those who do often speak of its calm, of the way time softens when the needle moves, of the way tension in the mind releases as the fabric comes together, of the way something so small as stitch can hold such weight. In an age of distraction, the slow art of sewing still invites presence, stillness, focus. It asks only for your hands and your heart. Pages and poetry, how reading shaped quiet evenings before the screen. There are few things as quiet or as powerful as the turning of a page. In an age before televisions bathed rooms in flickering light, before podcasts whispered stories into our ears, and before social media fed us endless lines of text, there was the book, bound in leather or cloth, pages stitched and pressed. A book was a doorway, and in the quiet hours after sundown, it opened slowly. The evening ritual of reading. For generations, reading was not rushed. It was not done in passing or in multitasking moments. It was a practice as low, focused, and sacred. After the dishes were cleaned and the lamps lit, books would be fetched from shelves that smelled of dust and ink. A favorite chair might be drawn closer to the fire. A shawl draped over shoulders, a candle trimmed. Then, the page. The act of reading was not just for knowledge, it was for presence, for stillness. A father might read aloud to his children, his voice slow and steady, each word weighed. A woman might cradle a novel in her lap, her eyes moving gently, mouth forming silent sounds. A boy might sit cross-legged on the floor with an atlas, lost in faraway maps, everyone in their own world but still together. Books as companions. In a time when entertainment was homemade, books became companions. They traveled from hand to hand, across family lines, between friends. A well-loved novel might show its age-cracked spine, corners folded, faint stains from a midnight cup of tea. Margins sometimes carried notes, small pencil marks, a sign that someone else had lingered there before. In homes with fewer means, perhaps there were only a few books, but they were cherished. Read and reread, known almost by heart. A worn Bible, a poetry collection, a tattered fairy tale. Even one book was enough to open a world. The shared voice, reading aloud. Reading was often a communal act. Long before audiobooks or bedtime cartoons, stories were read aloud in evening light. A parent might read by firelight while children listened, heads resting on knees or tucked under blankets. The voice, steady and calm, became the music of the night. In upper-class parlours, it was not uncommon for novels to be serialized read chapter by chapter across several evenings. One night, Dickens. The next, Austen or Thackeray. The pauses between chapters stretched suspense. The shared experience wove the household together. In farm cottages and small cabins, it might be a single poem, read slowly. A psalm, a fable, even a recipe could be read aloud, its familiar cadence grounding the listener in the familiar comfort of home. Poetry and peace. Poetry was particularly suited to these quiet hours. Its rhythm matched the heartbeat of evening. Its language, sparse yet deep, opened the door to contemplation. Some recited from memory. Wordsworth's Daffodils, Keats' Odes, Emily Dickinson's Riddles of the Soul. Others read in hushed tones, savoring each syllable as though it were warm bread. Poetry was not about solving or analyzing. It was about being still with something beautiful. Letting the words move through you like wind through grass. Some even wrote their own poems, small ones, scribbled into diaries, folded into drawers, forgotten until years later. Books and identity. Books did more than pass the time. They helped shape identity. A young girl reading Mary Wollstonecraft might begin to think about the roles of women. A boy devouring travelogues might feel the first stirrings of wanderlust. A farmer reading Thoreau could start to see his land in a new light. Books offered mirror-sand windows. They allowed people to see themselves and others more clearly. In a world often defined by repetition and labor, reading gave the mind permission to wander. Letters, diaries, and the written word. Not all reading came from books. Many evenings were spent with letters-folded sheets of thin paper, penned in elegant cursive, carrying stories across miles. A son's update from the city, a cousin's recounting of her new baby, a friend's confession, carefully phrased and sealed with wax. Diaries, too, were read, sometimes aloud, sometimes in private. They carried the quiet weight of days' weather notes, small triumphs, quiet fears. The written word was trusted. Even in its silence, it felt alive. Reading by lamplight and candle glow. Before electricity, reading after sunset required intention. Candles flickered. Oil lamps cast golden halos. Reading required positioning close to the light. Book tilted just so. Eyes squinted. Often growing tired before the mind did. But there was something magical about it. The way the light warmed the pages. The shadows moved across the floor. The reader, cloaked in the quiet, almost disappeared into the book. Some read, with companions nearby knitting, resting, thinking. Others read in solitude, the only sound, the turning of a page. Books in the hands of the many. Reading was not always accessible to all, but over time, books became more widespread. In the 19th century, lending libraries grew. Subscription services brought serialized stories into modest homes. Penny novels and chapbooks made tales affordable. And with rising literacy, the hunger for reading deepened. For those who had only a few books, they were read slowly, savored, discussed. The pace of life allowed this. No rush to finish, no pressure to post a review. Just the simple pleasure of letting a story unfold one page at a time. Reading for comfort, not escape today. We often read to escape, to distract, to fill time. But once, reading was more about comfort, intimacy, ritual. A familiar poem read on a rainy night. A cookbook page revisited for the fourth time. A favorite chapter, read aloud again, not for its plot, but for its rhythm. These were acts of quiet devotion. To the story, to the language, to the peace it offered. The final page. Eventually, every night came to its final page. The book was closed, the candle trimmed. A sigh, perhaps, or a silent smile. The words, though stilled, remained in the room like perfume faint, lingering, lovely. The book might be set on a side table, or returned to its place on the shelf, nestled among others, all resting like dreamers until tomorrow. And as the reader turned down the bed, or stirred the dying embers, they carried those words with them into sleep, not as noise, but as comfort, as peace. Sounds of the parlor, evenings of homemade music and quiet joy, before earbuds and concert halls, before recordings and streaming. Music was not consumed, it was created by ordinary hands, in ordinary homes, in rooms lit by lamps and warmed by fire. Music in the past was not loud, not polished, not always perfect, but it was present, and it was deeply, beautifully human. Evening settles slowly. Outside, the sky dims into soft gray. Inside, a quiet rhythm takes hold. The clink of teacups fades. The fire sighs. And from the corner of the room comes music. Not from a speaker, not from a screen, but from fingers real, imperfect, and warm. This was the sound of the parlor. An old piano, a humming voice, a fiddle's slow cry. Music not made to impress, but to share. Music was homemade. Before phonographs or radios, before symphonies could be streamed with a single click, music lived in the home. It was made by people you knew. A mother at the upright piano, a sister with a gentle voice, a grandfather who remembered old songs and could whistle in perfect tune. It wasn't polished, but it was alive. Parlor music was not performance, It was participation, a way for families to fill silence not with noise, but with something meaningful, comforting, communal. It might last an hour. It might last just a few minutes. But in that space between supper and bedtime, music had its place. The instruments of the home. The most common parlor instrument was the upright piano, often slightly out of tune. Its keys yellowed with time. The piano stood as both furniture and friend. Some homes, particularly middle-class ones, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, considered a piano essential. It said something about the home, that it valued art, practice, discipline, and joy. But not every home had a piano. Some had a fiddle, passed down from a cousin who played in dances. Others a flute, carefully wrapped in cloth and brought out only at night. A harmonica might rest in a drawer, its notes soft and nostalgic. And many homes had only voices. That was enough. Even hummings low, unconscious filled a room with presence. A culture of musical evenings. Evenings offered time, the kind of time that stretches out, not asking to be filled, but inviting something to unfold. A young woman might sit down and play a folk tune she learned as a child. A brother might join her, clapping quietly in time. Sometimes, someone would sing, or everyone would. The songs were simple, known by heart, verses passed down, refrains that soothed. I gave my love a cherry, Shenandoah, home, sweet home. Not every night had music, but when it did, it wrapped the room like a blanket. The role of singing. Singing held a unique place in domestic life. No formal training was needed, no accompaniment, just a voice, raw and unvarnished, full of memory. People sang lullabies to their children's soft tunes that barely left the lips. They sang spirituals while folding laundry, work songs while peeling potatoes, sacred hymns before bed. Music helped the soul breathe. In the parlors of the 1800s, sheet music collections grew. Songs were bought from local stores, brought home, practiced, then shared. Families might sit in a half circle, following along, harmonizing softly. The sound was not grand. It was intimate, almost private. A kind of music that belonged not to the world, but to the room. Folk tunes and family traditions. Many of the songs sung in parlors had roots deeper than the people singing them. Folk ballads from Ireland, sea shanties from coastal towns, spirituals passed through generations of hardship and hope, Old English rounds that played in children's games. Each family had favorites, songs associated with certain memories: an uncle's wedding, a sister's birthday, the first snow of the season. These songs lived long lives. They were not background music. They were moments, anchors. Even in the humblest homes, a mother might sing as she rocked her child. A father might tap rhythm on the table while someone hummed. No spotlight, no applause, just the joy of joining in. Music as memory and healing. Music remembered. It remembered lost loved ones, old places, forgotten days. A few notes could bring tears, or a smile, or silence. Sometimes, all three at once. In times of grief, people turned to hymns. In times of celebration, to reels and jigs. And in quiet, ordinary evenings, they turned to songs that felt like old friends. Music also soothed illness. A soft lullaby for someone unwell. A low hymn sung by candlelight. The act of singing, even alone, brought comfort. The room might be still, except for a hand strumming softly, or fingers tracing scales, or someone across the room, softly singing words no one quite remembered. Still, the song found its way out. Learning and practicing. For many, evenings were also for learning. Young girls were often taught piano as part of their education. Boys, too, when possible. Practice might occur earlier in the day, but in the evenings, the whole family might listen to a new song, or join in. Mistakes were expected. Wrong notes, forgotten lyrics, laughter. The process was not rushed. Children watched their elders and mimicked. They learned not from teachers, but from the room, from repetition and attention. A child might spend months mastering a simple melody, and when they finally played it, everyone listened. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Music without instruments. Even homes without instruments still had music. Some clapped hands, some whistled, Others told stories that included a refrain or recited rhyming games. Music, in its truest form, lives in rhythm, and rhythm was everywhere. The creak of a rocking chair, the ticking of a clock, the drip of tea, the syncopated rustle of turning pages. Life itself was musical, and into that rhythm, the occasional song was woven gently, without ceremony, the wind down. Eventually, the music stopped, not with a grand finale, but with a glance, a shared understanding, a slow closing of the piano lid. Candles were blown out, lamps turned low. The fire, still glowing, crackled softly as people rose from their chairs, stretched, and whispered their goodnights. The music, though gone, lingered in the quiet. Sometimes, a few bars hummed upstairs as someone brushed their hair, or a low whistle drifted from the porch as someone took in the stars. It was not silence that followed music. It was memory. Music and simplicity. Today, music is everywhere. It plays in shops, elevators, cars. It streams endlessly. But back then, it was precious, unpredictable, homemade. It came from the hands and mouths of people. And perhaps because of that, it carried more soul. Music filled the spaces between tasks, between thoughts, between breaths. It made the house feel full-even, if no one was speaking. Games by candlelight, quiet joys and shared laughter in the glow of evening. In the hours after the work was done, after supper had been cleared, and the fire had settled into a gentle murmur, came a different kind of ritual. Not for labor, not for learning, but for something simpler, play. Not all evenings were spent in silence. Not all time was filled with solemnity. Sometimes, when the house was still and supper had settled, there was laughter, soft, gentle, shared around a table like bread. In a world before screens, before digital boards, and beeping devices, games were played slowly, deliberately, with hands and glances, not buttons. By candlelight, with worn cards and wooden tokens, families gathered to play, not to win, but to be together. The table was the stage. The games weren't extravagant. There were no explosions, no high scores, no flashing lights, but there was presence. The table, perhaps the same one used for meals and letter writing, was cleared, wiped down, and made ready. A lantern was placed at the center, or a tall beeswax candle. Its light cast warm circles over worn boards and smiling faces. The flicker of flame brought out the shine in playing piece smoothed by decades of touch. It softened the sharpness of the room and invited everyone to lean in, to be close. This was not competitive sport. It was quiet companionship, simple games, deep connections. Families played dominoes, the clink of tiles forming soft music in the hush of evening. They laid out cards with practiced grace, euchre, whist, hearts. Each shuffle was an act of rhythm, each deal a small performance. Some played checkers, the red and black discs sliding smoothly over worn wood. Others played chess, pawns slowly marching across their battlefield by candlelight. Laughter often rose not at victory, but at mistakes, a misplayed card, a silly move, a moment of distraction. There was no rush, there was no shame, just amusement, gently shared. The goal was not mastery, it was memory. Games across generations. Children learned the rules from watching, not from books. A grandmother's patient explanation, a father's playful teasing, a sibling's whispered advice. The games became family lore. Remember when little Sarah beat Papa with 3 queens? Remember how Grandpa always forgot the rules, but somehow won anyway? These were not just games. They were traditions. Rituals wrapped in laughter. Stories lived and retold. Sometimes a child would fall asleep in a parent's lap before their turn came. Sometimes a game went unfinished, only to be resumed the next night. Time wasn't measured in rounds. It was measured in moments. Games without boards. Not all games required pieces. Many homes played word games. Riddles passed back and forth like secrets. Memory games, where each player had to repeat a growing list of strange, silly items. Games of wit, of rhyme, of imagination. There were games for naming animals by alphabet, games for spotting shapes in the shadows, tongue twisters, counting songs, quiet dares. These games cost nothing, needed nothing, only attention, only joy. They could be played around the fire, or on the porch, or while lying on the floor, staring up at the ceiling beams. Even in the poorest homes, play found a way. Seasonal games and special nights. Some games came out only at special times. In winter, as snow dusted the windows, families played longer game zones that stretched for hours or even days. A chess match paused overnight. A game of Monopoly played slowly, with tea and firelight and biscuits. In summer, when the sun stayed longer, games were lighter outdoors, perhaps with soft laughter echoing into the dusk. But even then, the return to indoor play held its own magic. On holidays, special decks or puzzles were brought out, dice made from bone, cards hand-painted years ago, games that felt like ceremony. The tools of play, the objects themselves, told stories. A checkerboard with a crack down the center from where someone leaned too hard, cards with curled corners and faded backs, dice that rolled just a little uneven, their numbers rubbed soft by years of use. These pieces were passed down, not just for fun, but for continuity, a link to those who came before. And then there were the handmade sets, a peg game carved in the barn, dominoes whittled during a long winter, a bag of marbles sewn from scraps. Games became artifacts personal, meaningful, and deeply loved. The pace of play. No one rushed. There was time to think, to joke, to pause and pour another cup of tea. The game was not an escape from boredom. It was a way of deepening the evening. And when disputes arose, they were gentle. I think you moved that piece twice. No, I didn't. Let's just start over. All right. There were no referees, no timers. Only the shared desire to keep the peace intact. Laughter in the quiet. The laughter wasn't loud. It didn't break the stillness. It grew from it. A misread rule. A surprising move. A child's unexpected cleverness. Sometimes, laughter came not from the game itself, but from the moments between when someone knocked over the candle with a sleeve, or mistook a raisin for a checker, or burst into giggles just because the night felt silly. These were the moments remembered. Not the score, not who won, but the sound of joy in the dark, ending the game. Eventually, eyes grew heavy. A yawn passed around the table like a slow wave. Someone said, "One more round," and everyone nodded, knowing it might be the last. Pieces were gathered, some in boxes, some in sacks. A cloth was laid gently over the board. The candle flickered low. There was no announcement, just a collective agreement that the night had reached its soft conclusion. Chairs pushed back quietly, blankets gathered, kisses on foreheads, the rustle of steps on wooden floors, and silence returned not as absence, but as presence. Why it mattered. These games did not change the world, but they changed the evening. They shaped how people came together, how they listened, how they laughed. In a time when entertainment was not bought or streamed, it was created in the moment with one's own hands, voice, and heart. The games made space for connection, for memory, for joy. And long after the pieces were packed away, the feeling of that candlelit room remained whole, warm, and quietly alive. The stars and the silence, nighttime reflections before sleep. Eventually, the games ended. The fire sank low. The last page was turned. And so began the quietest ritual of all, looking up. In the absence of screens, before the age of buzzing phones and glowing alerts, people ended their day with the stars. Not always with fanfare, not always for long, but with intention. A door creaked open. The night air greeted skin still warm from the hearth, and eyes turned skyward. The sky as companion. Long before televisions flickered in darkened rooms, the stars were evening's closing act. Not just a backdrop, but a presence, constant, unmoving in their movement, whispering reminders of time's slow passage. In farms, in villages, on city rooftops and forest clearings, people looked up. Some wrapped shawls around their shoulders. Others leaned against fence posts. A few simply stood barefoot in the grass, feet sinking into cool earth, head tilted toward the velvet sky. The stars didn't perform. They simply were. And in their quiet glow, people found peace, constellations, and the stories they told. The sky was never just starset, it was a canvas for imagination. Constellations became characters. Orion hunting across the heavens, Cassiopeia on her throne, the Great Bear lumbering through the night. These shapes were taught by fathers to sons, mothers to daughters, whispered like bedtime stories passed down by the cosmos itself. A child might trace lines with their finger in the air, trying to find the archer, the swan, the sea serpent. Even when the figures weren't fully visible, the stories filled in the spaces between the stars. In this way, skywatching became both science and myth, a gentle blend of knowledge and wonder. The moon's slow dance. Then there was the moon, a companion of many moods, a silver sickle hanging low over the hills, a glowing pearl rising slow and full, a faint whisper of crescent light above the trees. Its phases marked time for those who had no calendars. New moon, time to plant. Full moon, time to harvest. Its glow-lit paths for night walks, its pull-stirred tides and moods alike. People didn't just glance at the moon, they spoke of it. It's a hunter's moon tonight. She's bright enough to read by. Look at that. Hallorain must be coming. The moon wasn't distant. She was a familiar presence. The sounds of the night. Beyond the stars, the night itself had a language. Crickets chirped in unison. Owls called to each other across meadows. Wind rustled gently through the leaves, a soft hush that asked for nothing but listening. In summer, frogs croaked in distant ponds. In winter, snow muffled every sound, until the world felt padded, protected. Some homes near woods or open land would hear the distant bark of a fox, the quiet stomp of a horse in a nearby paddock. Each sound mocked a living world, still breathing under the stars. For those who listened closely, the night was not silent, it was sacred. Reflection and prayer. Stargazing often turned inward. A man staring at the stars after a long day might begin to think about his family, his future, his place in something larger. A woman sitting on her porch might fold her hands quietly and offer a prayer, not in words, but in presence. Reflection came easily in the dark. The mind, unburdened by chores and sound, could float freely. Questions drifted to the surface. Answers often didn't come, but peace did. In many traditions, the night was for prayer, for gratitude, for letting go. The stars held space for it all. Moments shared, and moments alone. Sometimes, stargazing was shared. Two people might sit side by side without speaking, shoulder to shoulder, watching the sky change. A parent might point out the North Star, helping a child see what they had always overlooked. Other times, it was a solitary act. A teenager, standing outside, trying to understand the world. An elder, remembering someone long gone. A farmer, leaning on a shovel, simply breathing. The stars asked nothing. They offered no judgment, only perspective. They had seen everything and still shone. Seasons in the sky. The night sky changed with the seasons. Winter brought Orion, striding high across the sky, crisp and clear. Summer offered the Milky Way, a soft smear of stars, like spilled sugar across the heavens. Spring teased with the appearance of new constellations, and autumn gave long evenings of early dusk and cool, quiet air. People marked these changes, not with celebration, but with recognition. The Pleiades are out. The harvest moon is early this year. There's Venus, just above the tree line. The sky was a clock, a calendar, a reminder that even the vastness above had rhythm and return, sleeping under the stars. In warm months, some chose to sleep outside, a blanket spread across a porch, a straw-filled mattress under an apple tree. Children snuggled close under quilts, their breath soft and even beneath the open sky. Stories were told until sleep came. Stars watched silently, twinkling approval. Even those who didn't sleep outdoors often ended their evening with one last look, a glance upward before blowing out the candle, a step onto the porch, before drawing the bolt. A final moment of stillness, of connection. The sky as a mirror, for all its distance. The night sky was deeply personal. It reflected moods, offered metaphor, gave perspective. A scattered sky mirrored a scattered heart. A clear sky, a sense of peace. Shooting stars felt like signs. The moon, a witness. The stars, a slow reminder that we are small and somehow still part of something vast and beautiful. And always, always, the return of light, of seasons, of constellations once forgotten. The sky did not need to speak to be understood. The candle, the fire, and the fade. Eventually, the night drew its curtain. The final candle flickered down. The coals in the hearth glowed faintly. The house fell into a hush, deeper than silence. And somewhere, high above, the stars blinked on steadfast, unchanging. People drew blankets close. Doors creaked closed. The earth exhaled, and sleep settled in. The stars remained, keeping quiet company until dawn.